Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. My name is Suzanne Duffner. I am the Community Development Director for the City of Monmouth, and I'm so happy that you could all be here today. I'm just thinking how wonderful it is to be back in person and not to have to wear necessarily a mask. So thank you for being here. We have a great presentation scheduled for you this afternoon with author John Dodge, who wrote The Deadly Wind, about the storm of the Columbus Day storm in 1962. So it's hard to imagine this is a 60th commemoration of that event. And I was not here during that time, but I liken it to those times in your life where you know exactly where you were, what you were doing, and those details of those memories of those moments. It's like 9/11 is how I imagine it in my life. So just learning and reading about this has been very interesting and fascinating to hear the stories, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of your stories as well after John has had a chance to give his slideshow presentation. So thank you for being here. We are recording it so that others can hear this as well, because we think it's a very interesting and exciting part of history of our area. So just by way of introduction, I did want to introduce our Historic Commission members from Monmouth. They are the ones that helped to organize this event, so thank you to them. We have our chair, Nita Wilson, who is your greeter back here. And then Lori Albert is here somewhere. Yes, yay! Thank you, Lori. Ron Woodward, or Woodruff, sorry, I pronounced your name wrong, and Jim Mannion in the back there. So thank you all. And our counselor, Rebecca Salinas Oliveros, is our council liaison. So wonderful group of people doing great things. We're doing a shameless plug for the train mural ribbon cutting that's happening next Thursday, October 13th at 6 p.m. It's on Catron Street, right next to the Partnerships and Community Living building. So we invited the community. Hope you can join us to celebrate that really beautiful mural, the Monmouth's newest mural there. So help yourself to refreshments. We have restrooms for those of you who aren't familiar with this building back here in the hallway. Hopefully you've had a chance to get a raffle ticket and be entered in to win a copy of A Deadly Wind book that's autographed by John Dodge. So if you haven't, raise your hand. We'll make sure that you get entered in to win that. And if you'd also, we have books for purchase for $20, cash check or credit cards can be taken for those. So, and one last item to mention, there is also more information about the Columbus Day storm in the Monmouth Public Library. There's a display going on for the month of October, so you can get some more information and pictures from there as well. All right, so let me go ahead and introduce our guest speaker today. John Dodge was a columnist, editorial writer, page writer, and investigative reporter for The Olympian prior to retiring in 2015 from an award-winning career that spanned 40 years. He and his wife, Barbara Dingman, live in the Olympia area and enjoy gardening, bird watching, hiking, reading, and traveling. And we are just so excited to have him here this afternoon to talk about this wonderful or this interesting event in history. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to John.
Well, thanks, Suzanne, and members of the Historic Commission for inviting me down here today to ground zero of the Columbus Day storm. I kind of feel like I'm in hallowed ground here, and as you can tell, the cover of the book commemorates a very significant event that occurred that day with the collapse of the tower off Campbell Hall on the campus of what was then Oregon College of Education and now Western Oregon University. And probably just as devastating was the damage the winds did to the grove right next to the hall. Sometimes we love our trees more than we love our buildings, and I think there were a lot of sad people there, and over in Salem at Wilson Park on the Capitol campus where trees were toppled down by these hurricane force winds. I'm going to come back to this a little bit of a story here later in the presentation, but for now I want to just quickly ask, how many folks in the room lived through the storm, experienced it somewhere or another? Okay, so we got a handful over here. And then we got some newbies too, so maybe they're going to learn something that from the rest of us. So I'm going to run through this presentation, and then I'll leave it open for questions, and hopefully I'll have answers. And we'll also offer folks a chance to share a quick recollection of what happened the day of the storm. And I know Jim here has a pretty good story to kind of play off of what's in the book. So, okay, let's get started. So here's some basic facts about the storm. It was the strongest windstorm in West Coast recorded history. We have yet to see anything like this make landfall, and 60 years since the event, nothing has surpassed it. Now, I'm just talking about the West Coast, and I'm just talking about extratropical windstorms. Now, it covered a vast area, much larger area than most hurricanes cover. It was born in Northern California, off the coast of Northern California, and swept its way north through Oregon and Washington, and even significant damage in southern British Columbia before it finally petered out. There were at least 63 direct and indirect deaths resulting from this storm. And here's the distinction I'm making there. Indirect would be someone that perhaps died of a heart attack trying to clean up wood, fallen timber and debris from their property, or someone that fell off their roof trying to put the antenna back up. You know, they wouldn't have lost their lives, at least at that point, without the storm having occurred. The others are much more direct. Most of those other fatalities, roughly 46, were direct victims of the storm. In most cases, folks that were struck by falling trees. There were about 300 serious injuries, and a serious injury I'm defining as someone that required hospital care. In Washington and Oregon alone, some 53,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. This is a Red Cross estimate. There's also a report of bus drivers, probably Greyhound, moving up the Willamette Valley that night after the winds have blown through the area, and saying it was pitch black, pitch dark, and almost the vast majority of outbuildings and farm barns were flattened or damaged. We're placing total property damage, including the loss of trees, at around $2 billion at a minimum, and maybe as much as $5 billion. Now, these figures are adjusted to 2013 dollars. So here we are almost 10 years later. So these numbers are a little low, with inflation, as we're all feeling it lately. So anyway, that gives you a sense of the scope of the story, of the storm. And I'll ask you to hold any questions till we get done, so bear with me. We often talk about how the storm compared to other famous storms. Many of us have read the book or seen the movie of the Halloween 1991 storm off the Atlantic coast called A Perfect Storm. Those winds were observed at about 70 miles per hour, maximum gusts, and the low pressure system of that storm was not as severe as the Columbus Day storm, and which had winds gusting way over 100 miles an hour in many locations. The storm itself was larger than Hurricane Katrina, which struck New Orleans in 2005, and had comparable winds of Katrina-like Category 3 hurricane. Most of the area where the winds were sustained to develop a hurricane force definition, hurricane force being anything over 70 miles an hour, but Category 3, 115 miles an hour, those numbers were reached in areas of Central Oregon and the Oregon coast and in the coastal range. So again, you guys, those of you who lived in this area were at ground zero for the utmost strength of the storm. The storm had stronger winds than Superstorm Sandy, which struck the East Coast in 2012. But one thing about the Columbus Day storm, it did not have the lethal storm surge that Katrina and Superstorm Sandy and the recent hurricane to strike Florida, Hurricane Ian, excuse me. I knew I'd say it wrong. Ian. It's the storm surges with hurricanes that cause most of the destruction and most of the fatalities. And that was just, we just didn't have that experience with this storm. We had very little rain. It wasn't a rainy event, and it wasn't a storm surge event. It was just flat out windy. So here we can see the birth and kind of path of the storm that became known as the Columbus Day storm. It started as Typhoon Frida in the Marshall Islands, some 5,000 or more miles from here in the Pacific Ocean. And these numbers you say 3, 4, 5 and on, those are our days in October. So if we were to look at where was the storm on October 8th, see, it was still pretty much not too far from its origin, but it swept across the ocean. It was beginning to lose some of its strength right around here. On the 11th, it was re-energized with a storm system from the Aleutian Islands moving down to the south, and another storm system from the south moving to the north, and it was like a big mixing zone right here. And then it swept south for a bit and then marched right up the coastline on the 12th before it finally dissipated on the northeastern end of Vancouver Island. You can see that's a long journey, and in most cases, these typhoons that begin in the Pacific, far from here, do die down and break up and don't cause much, if any, damage. But we do get fairly strong windstorms on the coast. Some of you have lived through several. And they're almost always the source almost always is a typhoon. The origin of those windstorms we've experienced is almost always a typhoon. Now, typhoons is a Pacific Ocean Western Hemisphere akin to a hurricane on the East Coast. They're basically the same thing. The hurricanes, though, are fed by warm ocean water. They move slowly. They're sluggish. They're filled with rain. They're usually don't cover that wide of an area. These windstorms from typhoons that we experience are fast-moving and very often no rain involved. And they receive their energy from the difference in atmospheric pressures, highs and low pressure systems, which generate wind. This is one of my favorite graphics to get a sense of what it was like that day. We'll start right here on the Oregon coast at Cape Blanco. There was a Coast Guard station there. You see 145 miles per hour winds. That wind you see the little plus there. That's because the wind meter, the anemometer, blew out at the station in the middle of the storm, and they have no accurate reflection of the size of the storm. However, or the wind gauge. However, there's estimates it was probably closer to 170 miles an hour. And then you move on up the coast. You can see these parallel white lines where the sustained winds are in the 100 to 120 range. There's Corvallis one of your neighboring communities, 127 miles an hour. It was so dramatic that the weatherman at the weather station at the airport there abandoned his station. It was blowing apart. A little out on the coast at the same time, winds were recorded at Newport, Oregon, 138 miles an hour. Again, a wall of sea foam and mist was blowing in off Yaquina Bay. Am I saying it right? And people were plucking seaweed off the windows of their homes a half-mile inland the next day. We've got 116 miles an hour on the Morrison Street Bridge in Portland. I think the 106 is Troutdale. 160 was in southwest Washington at another Air Force station. You can see it starts to diminish quite a bit when you get into Washington, but still we're pushing 100 miles an hour even as it crosses the border into Canada before it finally dies off. So what made this storm so strong? I'm trying to use language that I can understand, which means that it's not real scientific, but I did pass a test where I took this presentation to the annual meeting of the Oregon Meteorological Association in Portland, a room filled with meteorologists, and I was a little nervous. I'm not a scientist, I'm an author, I'm a writer, I'm a journalist, but they didn't punch any holes in it. They said I got it basically right. Maybe they were being kind, I don't know. But so why so strong? The biggest reason is that the storm was so close to land. Normally these storms that come across the ocean and reach the West Coast are further at sea when they're moving north. This one was right off the coastline. And the strongest winds in the storm, which are normally, the storm's moving in a counterclockwise manner. Strongest storm winds are usually in the southeastern vector of the storm, and that's put it right over the Willamette Valley and Puget Sound. The upper atmosphere and surface winds were both blowing from the south. That's not always the case with these storms. Sometimes they counter each other, one blowing one way, one blowing the other, but in this case they were blowing in the same direction, creating more force to the wind. And then the fact that these storms move fast, 40, 50 miles an hour, that adds to the velocity. There'd been some pretty heavy rains in the days prior to the storm, which had saturated the soil, made the trees more vulnerable to wind, fall, and that adds another element. And then here I'm taking a little liberty with the science, but storms like the Columbus Day storm go through a cycle of birth, that birth in this case being far out in the Pacific Ocean, growth, maturity, decline, and death. When this big blow made landfall, it was in the prime of its life. This home that you see pretty well smashed up in this picture is where I spent the storm. My family and the family of this gentleman, Bill Kildee, were huddled in the family room. You can barely see the wind. There's a window there that we were all peering out of. 2 or 3 big trees crashed into the patio and the roof. And so we got a pretty strong experience. And ironically, we were there because this is about 7:30 or so at night, 7:30. We were there because my folks were fearful that our home was in harm's way because we lived in the woods, and they were, fearful that trees would come down and hit our house. So we went to this house and had the trees come down. So, life turns on a dime, So my dad and I drove home about midnight that night to check on the condition of our house, and it was fine. Trees laid all over the yard and the pasture, and and in the woods, and there was a lot of down timber, but nothing hit the house or the garage. We were without power 8 days, which was pretty common throughout the region. Some of you may, over the years, come to rely on this man for your weather forecast, Portland meteorologist Jack Capel. How many have heard or listened to Jack over the years? Well, Jack was, he was a fairly young meteorologist in 1962. This picture is taken in 62, but it's not during the storm season, and you can see some of those temperatures. It looks more like summertime. But anyway, it gives you an idea of the TV weather station, the TV weather show that he presides over, and he also did a radio broadcast at about 5:15 every night during the week. He had a little office over at the at the Portland airport, and he'd been tracking information as it came in during the day about the storm, and that at first he was learning about it from ships at sea that were getting pummeled by the winds and huge waves, and they were radioing the information back to the Weather Bureau. And he was surmising this is a big storm, and then he's trying to figure out the path and the flow of the storm, and he noticed how weather stations from Medford and Grants Pass and Salem and Corvallis and Eugene, and we're all blacking out. No electricity, no power, no word from these communities. So he went on the air radio with his 5:15 report in Portland and said, the biggest storm I've ever seen, although he hasn't seen it literally, but figuratively, biggest storm I've ever seen is about to strike Portland, and he urged everyone to take shelter in a safe place. And then when he made the pronouncement, it's quiet, it's eerie, there's a yellowish green hue to the sky to the south. And he got in his car to go back to the main station on downtown Portland and started thinking, oh my gosh, have I put my reputation on the line? Where's the wind? Come on, I don't get it. And sure enough, before he even got over the bridge, I'm trying to remember, I think he went across, not Hawthorne, I can't remember which bridge he went across. But by then the bridges were closing down, billboards and tree limbs were flying through the air, and the storm had struck Portland at rush hour on Friday night. And he kind of had a feeling like, well, I'm vindicated. Kind of a sense of relief, even though he knew there was a lot of potential death and destruction in the air. So, and Jack was kind of known as the one and only weatherman that kind of went out on a limb and forecast, even though it was pretty darn late in the game, forecast the severity of the storm. This is Newport, Oregon. I had mentioned some of the damage there, but there was 20 or more buildings were either destroyed or heavily damaged, including homes. There was no loss of life, which I kind of find remarkable. This is a storefront near the top of the hill above Yaquina Bay, and just gives you an idea of what can happen in a big storm like that. Oh, here we are back to Campbell Hall. I had mentioned that this picture became the coveted picture for the cover of the book because it was the most well-known photo. It was one of the only photos I saw or anyone else could tell me about that showed action. I mean, you can see the tower crumbling. You can see the mortar and the dust as it's settling to the ground. I mean, within milliseconds that the tower is on the ground. And we have Wes Lukow, a 28-year-old student at the Oregon College of Education, to thank for that. Wes had been handed a 4x5 Graflex camera, box camera, by a photography instructor, he had photography was a hobby for Wes at the time. And he said, here, get some photos. And I'm about to ask Jim to chime in, but Wes was snapping away, and he was first of all fascinated by the grove and how the trees were snapping and falling over there. And he used up all but one exposure in his camera. And then he started noticing that the tower was wobbling and turning and twisting. And he thought, I better hold on here a minute and see what happens. And sure enough, the tower came down. That photo was picked up by Associated Press, ran all across the country and into Europe and beyond within 24 hours. Wes sold the photo to Life magazine for $400, and which was quite a bit of money for a college student back in the day. And he used the money to buy a stereo and a new camera, and he says, I bet I had the best dang stereo of any college student in town. And could I just ask you, Jim, to add just a quick little thought about, we're blessed today to have someone who was standing right next to Wes when that picture was taken. So just quickly tell people what you saw.
I had just moved out here from one of those flyover states, having been promised that in Oregon there is no violent weather, and had lived in this town for a month when the storm hit. It hit in two waves. In the Midwest, at least, we talked about always there being an eye in the storm. And the storm would go through and you'd get a gust and then a dead time. And in this particular case, the storm came through. The trees in the grove were, as we watched, and my office was directly across the street from this, and I was standing in the entrance to the administration building, and we watched those trees like battering rams hitting, going almost horizontal into Campbell Hall. We also watched the tower twist, and then there was the lull. And during that lull, college students being what they were, there were a couple co-eds that started through what remained of the grove. And we were all worried about that and about ready to run out there when some young men, probably college students, they looked very athletic, came running from the back corner of Campbell Hall, got those girls and got them out of there, and then this gust hit. And we knew the tower was going down, and I watched Les out there checking his light meter to make sure that he had the right focus on that camera.
So were those two cars crushed, or one of them crushed, or?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I was surprised to see the cars there. And I didn't know, I was new to the campus and had been there less than a month. I don't even know now whether there was parking permitted on that street, but apparently so.
Yeah.
So. Anyway, it was a tragic day. Those girls were saved, and we were all appreciative of that. And we got that classic picture.
This isn't too far from here. This is Oregon State Hospital in Salem. That's Dr. Dean Brooks, who was the superintendent there in 1962, and he'd already been there quite some time. And this shows him on the roof of the maximum security ward the next morning doing some makeshift repairs. It was a very chaotic night at the mental health hospital. Some of the inmates were patients is the right word, I believe, were jumping out of 2- and 3-story windows, broken arms, broken legs. There was 2 fatalities. I had a chance to interview Dr. Brooks. He was 95 years old, living in a assisted living facility within shouting distance of the hospital. That was 2014, I believe. Anyway, I think I was the last journalist to talk to him prior to his passing. He was the fellow that gave Hollywood the okay to film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest at the hospital. And if you recall, that'd be 1975. But it's based on the book by Ken Kesey, famous Oregon author Ken Kesey, who wrote the book in 1962, same year as the storm. But he had a remarkable career there, and he still had vivid memories of the storm all those years later. We are at Mount Hebo, at what was then an important radar station for keeping track of activity out in the ocean. We're in the middle of the Cold War, right? It's 10 days before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we had a network, we being the United States and Canada, had a network of radar stations along the western coast and eastern coast on the lookout for Russian bombers and potential nuclear attack. And when the storm hit Mount Hebo, which is a little over 3,100 feet high in the Coast Range, they were in the midst of putting a new shield over the radar called a radome. And those hexagonal squares formed the outside sheeting of the dome. They weigh between 90 and 150 pounds, and the wind just got inside there and tore it apart. And those hexagonal sections were flying through the air like monstrous frisbees, and some of them were slicing trees in half. Again, nobody was injured or killed, which seems remarkable. The station became obsolete in the 1970s after the development of the intercontinental ballistic missile and the ability to deliver warheads by submarine, at thousands of miles per hour compared to a bomber lumbering across the ocean. So it's a thing of the past, and they looked at Mount Hebo at the site here as a possible prison site for Oregon prison system, and came to the conclusion it was too inhospitable of a place. The weather's really rough up there, and I've been there a couple times now. It was blowing hard both times. If you get lucky, and maybe some of you have, on a clear day, you can see all the coast, all the Cascade Mountains, and in both directions up and down the coast for miles and miles. Has anyone been there on a clear day, Mount Hebo? Have you, Barbara? Yeah. It must be pretty spectacular. Yeah, it's a wonderful vantage point, but it was very exposed. Timber was the big force multiplier in the storm, the thing that caused the most damage, and the forests were very hard hit throughout the region. I find this one interesting because see that fellow up there with his hard hat on? They were out salvaging timber, setting up timber sales 3-4 days after the storm in the Siuslaw National Forest. And if you look at all of the region, there was enough timber on the ground, about 15 billion board feet, which is enough to frame about 1 million homes. This is one of my favorite shots. We're in Southwest Washington. I think it's the South Fork Toutle River drainage, I believe. There's Mount Rainier back when it was still a perfectly formed volcano, 18 years before it blew its top. And in the explosion of Mount St. Helens, a lot of timber came down, but it was only about a third of what came down in the Columbus Day storm. Thing that's important to note here is that the fallen timber probably was the most significant lasting legacy of the storm because it gave birth to the log export industry in the Pacific Northwest. Up until then, there'd been very little timber leaving our forests and going across overseas to Japan or other Pacific Rim nations. That all changed after the storm, and it's still to this day a significant part of the timber industry. Single engine, twin engine planes didn't fare so well that night and day. They were blowing around like toys. There were reports at airports all throughout Oregon and Washington of planes top turned upside down and skidding around on the ground, and some actually lifted off the ground and flew without a pilot, some a couple hundred yards, and in some cases reports of over a mile, airborne for over a mile just on the strength of the wind. Here we are looking at just some there's the Van Buren Bridge in Corvallis, sliced in half by a big Doug fir that came down. And then on the Capitol campus in Salem, the Circuit Rider, that bronze statue weighs 3.5 tons. It was knocked over. And right next to it, Wilson Park was destroyed. So again, this area is ground zero. So what happens today if a similar storm struck? Well, the best news is that we'd have a lot more advance notice. Weather forecasting 60 years ago was more an art than a science. There was very little known about what was happening out in the Pacific Ocean, and forecasters didn't have the computer modeling they have today. They didn't have the satellites circling the Earth providing pictures of the atmosphere. They didn't have buoys stationed out in the ocean gathering weather data. We didn't have a Doppler radar system along the coastline. So as you can imagine, they were really throwing darts at the wall when it came to forecasting weather. They could pretty well figure it out for a few hours in advance or maybe a day, but nowadays we're in the 3 to 5 days, almost a week in advance, we're getting an inkling of what's about to hit. So we're better off in that respect in terms of preparing. On the minus side, we've probably tripled our population in the last 60 years, putting millions more people in harm's way. The built environment has expanded. Property damage could easily exceed could reach tens of billions of dollars if that same storm hit today. Climate change. So far, the research does not suggest that we're going to see stronger and more frequent non-tropical windstorm. That's what this is. We haven't seen them in the past 65 years, and the computer modeling doesn't indicate that it's likely to be exponentially greater in the years ahead. This story holds true on the Pacific Ocean western side of the country. On the east side with the smaller Atlantic Ocean, we are seeing increase in hurricane intensity. I think we all saw what happened just a little more than a week ago in Florida. The jet stream that's the main transport vehicle for these big storms is shifting to the north slowly and slightly. We may see more activity in Washington and BC, a little less in Oregon, so maybe you're in a better place now than I am in Olympia. The main reason that they're not predicting automatic increase in intensity or frequency is that the Arctic region right now is warming 2 to 3 times faster than our neck of the woods. And when you have that happen, you lose some of that temperature differential that you need to create our windstorms. Because I mentioned that they're born out of a rapid change in pressure, and right now without the Arctic is warming so fast, it's not as going to provide the fuel at the rate that would lead us to believe that we'd have more violent storms. All of that said, there's nothing to say a storm as powerful as this one could be in our near future. And then I just want to kind of close with a photo of a kid that just reminds us all of how bizarre, what kind of bizarre stories you can gather from a major weather event. Little Charlie was a 7-year-old boy in Spanaway, just outside Tacoma. He was outside playing in the wind, trying to fly. It's dusk. The wind's howling, blowing the roof off his house that his dad had just reshingled the week before. And out of the darkness lopes this large animal that he couldn't identify, and it pounced on him and started mauling him, and it was a lion. And it turned out the neighbors had 2 pet lions in a flimsy cage, not a cage, but more like a flimsy wooden enclosure in their backyard. And the enclosure blew apart, and the lions, 2 twin female lions, were set free, and they were roaming the neighborhood doing. They mauled Charlie. They mauled another woman, and the question comes up: well, how'd they get their hands on lions? And it turns out that in our state, and I'm not sure about Oregon, but you could have exotic pets all the way until about 2006 before we started passing laws prohibiting private ownership of lions, bears, cougars, that sort of thing. Now, I think these 2 lions were surplus from the Point Defiance Zoo in Tacoma. I wasn't able to verify that 100%, but I had more than one person tell me that's where they believed they came from, including Charlie's father. Charlie was lucky. He could have lost eyesight. He was rushed to the hospital after his dad pried the lion off him. He ran into the house. The father called a neighbor and came with his car, and they jumped in the car. The lion was clawing at him as he's getting in the car because he had the blood of Charlie the scent of Charlie on him. And anyway, he got to the hospital, got patched up. They ended up with a small pittance of a settlement with the family, enough money for Charlie when he turned 18 to buy a 1964 Ford Galaxy. And Charlie grew up to be a plumber, just like his dad. And then I met with Charlie about 7-8 years ago when I was starting research on the book at Cabela's store near Lacey in Lacey, Washington, in the cafe, and about 10 feet away was a stuffed lion. And I asked Charlie if it kind of gave him the creeps, or, how do you feel? Did it traumatize you, or were you afraid of big animals? Did you like going to the zoo? And he goes, none of that stuff bothered me. And so I checked with his dad, and he goes, baloney. He didn't even like large dogs after that. But anyway, one of the more interesting stories in the book and amazing. Again, he's lucky to have avoided more serious injuries. Well, I've overstayed my welcome here on the talk, and we'll turn it over to questions at this point. Thanks so much.
So I have to ask, what happened to the lions? Did they animal control get them or
well,
something?
the sheriff's department was called. 2 deputies were dispatched. They shot the lions, killed the lions, and one of them gave the empty shotgun casings to Charlie, who kept them for many years. Yeah.
Where were you guys in the house? Did you have to hole up in the bathtub or something?
Well, it looks worse than I remember it. We were in the family room, and the trees came down, and most of the damage they did was on the other side of the house. Nobody was hurt. There was a lot of repair work to do, but their fence blew away, windows were broken. It was pretty rough on that house.
Well, my name is Mary Oliveros, and my husband and my aunt, my daughter-in-law. But I remember that day that we had gotten home from school. And we lived over at Ovid, the Long Branch. I'm sure some. Long Acres, it
Long
was
Acres.
at first? Okay.
Ovid Long.
Ovid Long, does anyone remember Ovid Long?
It's across the river or what?
Yeah, it's you cross the bridge and then you go left and then you get to that branch that was there. We had just been here like maybe 2 years.
Uh-huh.
And I had never seen a storm. Never. We were coming from Texas, and I don't remember seeing so many hurricanes back then, either in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So that day, I remember that we got home from school, and my dad and my mom and my grandparents, one set of my grandparents, were going to town. And they were getting ready to
Yeah.
just drive away.
Business as
and
usual.
then suddenly we were outside and we just felt this wind coming hard. And then we were looking at trees falling all over us. And now I say, my God, when we scared, why weren't we scared? We could have been killed. We were all out there running and we're so happy to see the winds blowing.
Just to survive, yeah. Well,
And
so many
then-
people had no idea what was happening.
No,
Then-
and I can't believe, nowadays, we're just watching the news.
yeah, and you get
back
advance
then-
warning. Yeah, not
And
back then.
that night, we had to, it was just like 3 families that were there,
Mm-hmm.
3 or 4 families. And Mr. Long told my dad, you all have to go to a higher place. Go to a cabin where it's the highest. And we all spent the night in one cabin. And you could hear the roaring of the river and the wind, and it was so scary. But then I kept thinking, what would have happened if Mom and Dad had gone to town and we would have stayed there by ourselves?
And you know, it hit many communities at rush hour, and a lot of working men wanted to get home and be with their families, protect their families, so they're driving through it probably foolishly, recklessly, down power lines, falling trees, can't get home the normal route, driving all over.
Oh,
Yeah.
the next day, we were told that they were going to pick us up on a boat. So everybody was scared because we had never been on a small boat, and this weather and everything. And oh my God, my grandma was so scared.
Well, you're never
But
going
all
to
the
forget
kids
it.
of my brothers were all excited. Hey, we're going on a boat ride.
Yeah, the different ages react to the storm differently. Young kids are excited. Moms and dads are protective of their children, worried.
My name is Felix I. Oliveros, and I live in Independence. In 1962, I was just a 19-year-old. You think like a 19. And one of the things is that, I thought I said to close it.
No.
And the wind started getting pretty loud, and we live in town. We were one of the lucky ones that were in town. We used to live in the cabins, but we bought a house on 6th Street, and I went out and I see all this. I said, "Oh man, it's getting harder, louder and louder." And we live close to the Pioneer Park, which is on 6th Street, and a bunch of trees started coming down. And in the corner, there were next to us was a bunch of trees that started coming down. So we just prayed that none of those trees will hit our house. But one of the things that really got me, it was the amount of water that came that day. The next day, we went to town. I went to the bridge,
Uh-huh.
and the water was very high. You know where the stop sign is? It was above the stop sign.
Huh.
And all that was water. And I didn't know what these people that what are they going to do? They cannot use. They have to have a boat because that's the only way.
Yeah.
But I never seen so much water.
Wow. Interesting.
It was amazing.
Anybody else before I turn it back over to Suzanne?
I moved to Oregon in 2006, but I had an internship in Eugene in 1967. And I met a friend down there who said that he and his wife, when the storm came, were at an orphanage somewhere along the coast being interviewed to adopt a baby. And the storm came, and they all kind of got up and looked out the window, and there were 5 cars in the parking lot, and one tree, another tree, another tree. Finally, the 5th tree hit his car, and they were stuck there. But the staff for the orphanage couldn't come in for the night shift, so he and his wife stayed all night taking care of the babies in the orphanage, and they passed the application and got their baby adopted properly.
That's a good story.
All right. Well, thank you again, John, and thank all of you for your great stories. And please feel free to help yourself to more refreshments. They have a lot. There's some pumpkin cake over there from Rick's. And yeah, thank you all again so much.